Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus doing a quick rundown on the results of the prelims from Christmas Day until New Year's Eve 2019. This is something that I brought up here on the channel about whether people would be interested. Been debating what formats to try to put the data in. Tried a circle chart on Facebook. The results were not positive, so I'm just going to go with the simple data. Hopefully this is easy enough for everyone to understand. So the 5 events were on the 31st of December, 30th December, 27th December, 26th, and 25th. There were a total of 81 decks. Decks are kind of put in numeric order in terms of percentage. Obviously, these are kind of combined decks, like UrzaOko could be 3-color Urza, 2-color Urza, 4-color Urza with Oko. So this is kind of a grouping of several different variants of what's relatively the same deck, but there can be slight differences in the variations. Eldrazi and Titanfield, which is a deck we'll cover here in 1 second as we're going through a couple decks to note from the event. Beyond that, things break down into different things. With Grixis Death Shadow, Bant Snow, and some other decks performing well. The summarized version is basically UrzaOko was almost 20% of the total field, which for Modern is kind of absurd over the course of 5 different events. Now, keeping in mind these are the preliminaries, these are the kind of pay-to-enter PTQ events, they're basically the pre-PTQs to get you your 40 qualifier points to get into the big events that are important now on Magic Online. So big events, people are tending to play decks that they either have or think will do well in these events. Death Shadow variants, 11% of the field. Eldrazi, about 12.3% of the field. Titanfield, which is basically an amalgamation of the Field of the Dead decks from Pioneer and Historic, in addition to the Amulet Titan decks. And then burn variants do in about 7%, and then the snow mid-range control decks, which can be like basically Bant Snow Control, Bant Snow Blade, or the various different mid-range decks that are basically they're utilizing planeswalkers like Oko to Fairy. Some variants are using Run-In 6, some variants are using the Saheeli Felidar combo. So kind of a amalgamation of things that are basically trying to exploit Arkham's Astrolabe, Icefang Coatl, and the 3-mana planeswalkers as kind of a mid-range control shell. And then obviously the rest other is everything else in the rest of the field. And let's cover a couple of decks that I think were kind of notable for what they were doing in the meta. So first up is kind of the boogeyman of the format. This is kind of an example of the decks that people have been playing. They're utilizing things like Urza and Oko to take advantage of things with like Metallic Rebuke, Cryptic Command, Archmage's Charm, all fueled by Urza itself. The deck uses a lot of cheap artifacts to get, with things like Gilded Goose and Emery, create a large battlefield full of artifacts and stuff, which allow you to leverage your Urza to be able to use Archmage's Charm, Cryptic Command, Metallic Rebuke to control the game, and then you're using things like Mystic Sanctuary to buy back your Cryptic Commands, Archmage's Charms to get some value. You're using things like Arkham's Astrolabe and Mox Opal to kind of fill your battlefield quite early on. It's not unusual to go like turn 1 Gilded Goose, Mox Opal, some other random Mishra's Bauble, have access to 2 mana play Emery, or 1 mana play Emery. Beyond that, you're leveraging Oko here to create a bunch of food tokens. Works well with Urza. Oko itself can kind of take over the game when backed up by these cheap counter spells. And then beyond that, you're just trying to beat your opponent down with large Urza tokens, or just arbitrarily winning the game with, Urza's card advantage. Some versions are opting for the Thopter Sword combo. Some versions are still playing War of Invention. But this is the most basic kind that you're seeing a lot of times. This is the deck. It's basically a blue-green base, and then they're playing some type of interaction in the sideboard for more aggressive decks. I've run across a purely blue-green version. I guess we could actually take a look at Canister's list, see what he's running. But I've run across this is like a very pure blue-green list, running Icefang Coatl to kind of blunt what your opponent's doing. I'm also run across the version that we were just looking at that's running like Path to Exile on the sideboard. Some versions are running like Fatal Push and stuff out of the sideboard. So that with access to Mox Opal and fetch lands in the format, obviously you're able to splash a 3rd color relatively easy for any type of interaction you need out of the sideboard. Deck's just very powerful. It's one of the strongest things going on in Modern, and it is kind of currently the top deck to beat. There is one deck that's kind of emerged in some regards to fight it, and we'll cover that in 1 second, and that is the Amulet Field decks. It's one of the decks that emerged to kind of fight the various different versions of Urza is kind of a Field of the Dead ramp-based deck centered around Primeval Titan. The core of the deck is Primeval Titan, a Boreal Graze, or Sakura Tribe Elder, and then whatever random acceleration you want to use, whether some versions have used Explore, some versions have used Search for Tomorrow. Once Upon a Time is kind of a staple to hold it all together. Usually 4 Summoners pack, 4 Once Upon a Time, 4 Primeval Titans, some number of Okos. Exactly what package people are playing varies. I don't think there's a particular strength one way or the other of the different packages. There was one version that I noticed on Twitter that even showed me this type of archetype was like a Wargate version of the deck that allowed you to fetch up any one of your lands. But basically the deck is a Field of the Dead mid-range ramp deck, kind of trying to overwhelm the Urza decks with what they're trying to do. They really cause problems for the opponent trying to control the game in the ways they just kind of overwhelm the Urza deck with basically uncounterable things. Once you start getting your Cavern of Souls or your Field of the Deads going, just kind of overwhelm the Urza deck, since that deck doesn't close out the game particularly quickly. It just relies on certain ways to control the game. So this is one way that things have kind of emerged to fight the UrzaOko decks. Unfortunately, in and of itself, it's playing Oko. This particular version is playing Karn the Great Creator, which obviously, if it resolves against Urza decks, is usually pretty good. Shuts down a lot of their stuff except for Urza itself. Beyond that, the details on the deck lists vary, but a lot of them are trying to do a lot of the same things. I think this is one of the more simplistic versions. They're trying to obviously do things with very powerful ramp into payoff with Primeval Titan and this stuff. It does lack the kind of closing combo of Amulet Titan, but still kind of overwhelms with sheer grinding power and brute force. And there's only a few decks that can really counteract something like that. Obviously hard combo decks, things like Tron and such can go over the top of this, but when those decks are kind of being pushed out by UrzaOko decks themselves, it's really kind of hard to fight on that particular axis. And then other aggro decks like Burn have kind of struggled in the face of Oko and Eldrazi-tron being the top decks in the format. The next deck that's kind of emerged is the Mono Red Burn deck, which I believe is based on Sandy Dog MTG's finish down here. It's a very simplistic version of Mono Red. It kind of capitalizes on a lot of things M. Hayashi has been doing, and that is just kind of playing a Mono Red Burn deck with a bunch of the Canopy lands. This particular version is also leveraging Soulscar Mage, so you have even more 1-drops get on the board quickly, which I think is a key at beating something like Oko. I've always considered that board presence is one of the sure ways just to be able to fight through, using your burn spells to remove their blockers, especially if they're just trying to create Elks to block. This version is leveraging a lot of things like Lava Dart, Lava Spike, Lightning Bolt, Searing Blaze, Rift Bolt, and then Skewer the Critics. Some versions are running things like Seal of Fire. I know in his article, Mike Flores was talking about running Light Up the Stage in a very similar shell. I think this is obviously a very simplistic version. You can take a look at what Sandy Dog did himself. I guess he just did the simplistic version. But basically, you're just trying to leverage a bunch of cheap mono red spells, and you're only running like a couple of 2-drops in Eidolon and Searing Blaze. So you're giving up some of the utility of Boros, the Boros Charms, the Lightning Helixes and such for a lower curve, and then the ability to kind of have more cantrips to kind of mitigate flood a little bit. I really like the approach this deck is taking. I don't think it's quite to the maximum of what Burn could be doing in the format. Obviously here on the channel we've been doing some Oko Burn, which is kind of a meme, but also attacks some of the various problems of Burn itself. But notable in these finishes, while Burn does have, I think it's like seven finishes of 3-2 or better in these 81 results, Boros only had 2 of those results. So the question becomes, is Boros really the top Burn style right now, or are adaptations needed to be made. There's a few other decks that have been floating around that I'm going to take a look at just out of sheer curiosity at what they're doing. I've noticed they put up some results, so we'll take a look at those, starting with Kethis Combo. So Kethis Combo, this is a style of deck that has been used in both Pioneer and Historic and in Standard when it was in Standard. Basically, you're using Kethis, the Hidden Hand, and a bunch of legendaries to mill your deck, and then you try to mill your opponent out by doing that. This deck takes it a step further with the addition of Grinding Station in Modern, which allows you to sacrifice an artifact, mill a player for 3 cards, and then when you're playing a bunch of cheap artifacts along with Emery and Hope of Gear 4 gives you a lot of artifacts, and obviously you can pump out artifacts with Oko. This is very much an artifact-based theme deck, and then you're using things like Unearth to get back Emery and Kethis, which allow you to mill yourself and then eventually mill your opponent out. Very simple combo deck. You're just trying to basically outrun your opponent in most games, game ones. You can usually set up the combo probably, turn 3 or turn 4 with pretty reasonable draws. No need for anything like Diligent Excavator, which the Pioneer decks has had to run, as well as the Historic deck. And this is obviously an Oko deck, a Teferi deck, and then you have a secondary win con in Saheeli, which can allow you to pump out a bunch of tokens and maybe overwhelm your opponent and kill them. Sideboard, you've got some interaction for whatever your opponent's trying to do. Metallic Rebukes obviously are pretty nice when you're pumping out a bunch of artifacts. 4th copy of Oko. Sai is a go-wide strategy that a lot of these artifact egg decks have been using. And then obviously things like Fatal Push and can help slow down the aggro decks. Veil of Summer can stop discard and counter spells. Collective Brutality can be kind of a catch-all against some of the more aggressive decks like Burn and such, while also allowing you to have more discard against some of the control decks, which could possibly stop some of your combo pieces if they have some early interaction like Spell Pierces, Mystical Disputes, etc. It's a very interesting deck. I find it funny that this deck has done well a couple different times throughout these 5 leagues. This one particular one had a 4-1, another one had a 3-2. Very powerful deck. It looks like a lot of fun if you're into that kind of thing in Pioneer and we're in Standard. So something I thought I would point out. And then there's one final version, which is a variant of Burn that I might try out soon myself. Doesn't use Oko, but it is definitely designed to fight Oko and Urzatron. So the final version of Burn that popped up, and there are some considerations with it that I don't particularly like, but I do find it interesting. For instance, the 4 ops just seem a little out of place with this particular build, but basically the premise is the same. You're playing a mono-red burn deck in the main deck with some red lands with Spire Bluff Canal and such. The main reason is you're splashing for Ceremonious Rejection and Mystical Dispute. Ceremonious Rejection gives you the ability to fight Eldrazi-tron, and it could potentially come in against certain things out of the UrzaOko decks depending on their build. And then Mystical Dispute allows you to fight the Urza fight on the stack, as opposed to trying to overwhelm it with burn spells, etc. So I think this is a novel approach to trying to attack the meta, particularly the top 2 decks, which have become problematic, especially for burn, as a quick Oko can be very difficult for burn to overcome, and then obviously Eldrazi-tron is just a very difficult overall matchup, and still kind of bewilders me a little bit by why Urzatron does so well in the current meta. I guess part of it has to do with the, obviously, Karn the Great Creator package and the fact that it can just pressure people. London Mulligan helps them immensely, and the presence, or lack of presence, of regular Tron in the format kind of helping them out a lot. So obviously this meta is very skewed. A lot of people are expecting Oko to get banned. If we go back to the regular data, Oko obviously being 20% of the field, Death Shadow variants, 2 or 3 of those were 4-color Death Shadow, and those had Oko in them. Titanfield decks are running Oko, the Snow mid-range decks, so even if you just look at like the Snow mid-range decks, the Titanfield decks, and Oko, you're looking at 20%, 28%, 35%, so roughly 35 to 38% of the decks people are running in these events are running Oko. So the card is not quite as problematic as something like Hogak for the format, but the card is definitely omnipresent. People are skewing their decks to play the card. So it is something to be aware of. Your deck simply has to have a way to either fight Oko or get around it or not care about it. So obviously decks like Storm and Ad Nauseam kind of do that in their own way. Tron feels like it's a deck that should fight that fight, but for some reason doesn't. I don't know if it's just the nature of the current format, but the Bant Snow decks, obviously, those are also playing Oko, so you've got another 8%. So maybe 40 to 45% of the field is playing Oko, and I think the card playing results kind of showed that out, like the top card, like 42% or something. It's kind of absurd that Oko is such a high percentage of the field, and I think it's definitely approaching bannable numbers. So I hope this information was kind of useful to you. I'll try to segment things into the various deck discussions and the overall discussion. But I wanted to get this video out there, see what you guys think of this format. Let me know with some tweaks and stuff. Try to be respectful. I understand that this is kind of bare bones explanations, but I did ask you guys if you were interested in this kind of a breakdown for Modern and Pioneer, especially the preliminary events, which I think are a little bit more high value data than like the MOXs, the challenges, and such. I think other people break down the overall like generalization of data. I wanted to focus specifically on basically the new Premier Play events for Magic Online, and kind of breaking down what the data tells us, what the grinders and such are playing at the top tiers here and doing well with. So hopefully this information is useful to you. This has been John for MTG Nexus. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe to the channel.